We all know the tragic events that took place on September 11th, 2001. But what we didn't know is prior to that attack, one of our first lines of defense was our armed pilots.
And it's fascinating because many people were unaware that pilots were actually armed. Or, John, we know a lot of this changed suddenly in 1987 when a disgruntled employee boarded the plane, killed the manager who fired him along with the two pilots, and the plane ultimately crashed.
Yes, and in 2002, directly after the September 11th tragedy, GOA worked with those pilots to bring back law that allowed pilots to be armed on aircraft.
And now look, they do have to go through some specialized training. They're not just saying you get a gun and board a plane. We recognize, John, that being thousands of feet up in the air, it's a dangerous scenario. But to have armed pilots be able to be that first line of defense could absolutely make the difference from life or death for a lot of those innocent passengers.
100%. And once we learned of this, we had to get GOA and those pilots together to tell the story that so many of us have not heard.
And it's a fascinating story.
So Eric Pratt from GOA will be moderating a panel of 10 pilots who will be telling their stories and recounting the events that happened on both September 11th and after.
And this is a fascinating story. We found out about it and we realized we had to bring this story to you all. I think you're going to learn a whole lot. Share this information with people out there who may be a bit afraid, John, still of boarding planes, particularly as we're seeing an increase in terrorism across the globe. We're seeing an increase in domestic issues and within our own country. 100%. And so knowing that if you're boarding a flight, that your pilot may be trained and a skilled individual carrying a firearm, I think may bring a lot of comfort to a lot of people out there.
100%. And always remember that these are the rights that GOA fights for us on a daily basis. So I hope you enjoy this.
One of the things that's interesting to know and important to know is that airline pilots were always armed from the earliest days of commercial aviation, the dawn of commercial aviation, all the way through 1987. And on January 1st of 1988, pilots were disarmed. On December 7th, of 1987, an employee, a ground operations employee of US Air, who had recently been terminated and used his employee ID that had yet to be taken from him to bypass airline security. He was illegally carrying a .44 Magnum revolver. The supervisor who had fired him was also on board. The flight took off, and while it was cruising at 22,000 feet, the terminated employee walked to the front of the cabin, produced his firearm, and shot the forward flight attendant to death. He then broke into the cockpit, and the Captain Greg Lindemood, who was the captain of that flight, turned around and said, "What's the problem?" And the murderer said, "I'm the problem." He then executed both pilots, shot them both to death. He then disconnected the autopilot, and through some what we call the controlled disconnects, he was able to put this aircraft into a 70-degree dive. Everyone, of course, was killed when the airplane crashed into the Santa Lucia Mountains of San Francisco. How did the FAA respond to that? They said that from now on, all airline employees are going to be required to go through security so somebody can't bring a gun on board. The airlines complained and said that's unworkable because ground operations employees are constantly going back and forth between the secure and the non-secure side. So the FAA relented and said, okay, only the flight crews need to go through. The people in the cockpit who might have had a chance, but if they had been armed, they could have used their weapons to defend themselves and their passengers. But those very people that had that opportunity, that last opportunity, were now disarmed, while the ground operations employees were still continued to bypass security. That rule is in place to this day. Among the many pilots who chose to carry a firearm prior to January 1 of 1988, was Captain Victor Saraceni. Captain Saraceni told his wife, Ellen, he said that he predicted that there would be attempted cockpit takeovers as a result of this new rule that the FAA had passed. Tragically, Captain Saraceni was proven absolutely correct when his airplane, United Flight 175, was hijacked by terrorists and flown into the South Tower of the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Gun control was the cause of the September 11, 2001 attacks. Never forget that.
September 11, 2001, it's a date like the Kennedy assassination. Everybody remembers where they were, what they were doing. And I was about to get on the highway to go to Capitol Hill for a meeting when I heard the news. And so I detoured to our office. And like the rest of the country was watching the news, I was in Larry Pratt's office. He was the executive director of GOA at the time. And I remember vividly, after the first tower had fell, but before the second one did, Larry looked up and said, if those pilots had been armed, this would not have happened. And from that very moment, GOA began working on legislation to arm commercial airline pilots in defense of terrorism.
I banded together with a group of like-minded airline pilots, and there were many of us all over the country who were thinking the same things.
Between the Gun Owners of America and Diana Bannister in Shirley and Bannister Public Affairs, they opened up a lot of doors for us. We met with a lot of people, a lot of staffers, a lot of congressmen and senators themselves, and we told them about the common sense value of arming pilots as a last line of defense. More importantly, as a first line of deterrence, because if the bad guys in the world thought that the pilots on board their aircraft were armed, they would be less likely to attempt to do something like they did on 9/11.
And what we're looking at, and what people were still trying to grasp, was the paradigm shift in thinking on airline security and hijacking threats. There is no other answer to the force of the lethal threat that these terrorists would pose, other than to meet it with up to and including lethal force.
When we first started the project with the pilots, there were many people who were skeptical that it could be done. We had the Bush administration was against it. Even some members of Congress who we would normally think Second Amendment type people would be in favor of it, they were opposed to it as well. You know, we have to give all credit to Gun Owners of America and others in the Second Amendment community. It was all a team effort, really. There were pilots from every different airline. There were also organizations who were helpful, and of course members of Congress trying to do that. Brian Darling on the Hill. We had Bob Smith and Conrad Burns and others who were really behind this. But of course, in the end, we get Barbara Boxer as the co-sponsor.
In the fall of 2001, we worked to get a provision in the bill that created the Transportation Security Administration that allowed pilots to be armed under certain conditions. Unfortunately, in April of 2002, John McGaugh, who was head of the TSA at the time, decided to stop the program. He was empowered by law to stop the program. So we worked towards putting a provision in the bill that ended up creating the Department of Homeland Security that ended up arming pilots and created the FFDO program, the Federal Flight Deck Officers Program. Tracy Price and a number of pilots were instrumental in putting together an organization, and we ended up linking them up with Gun Owners of America, who played an instructive role in getting this legislation across the finish line. We worked very closely with Gun Owners of America to put together the legislation and a strategy, and they were very helpful in getting their membership to call staffers and members of Congress to get this legislation moving. So there was a huge public relations campaign, and Gun Owners of America was critical in getting people activated to contact the members of Congress to show that the American people wanted their pilots to be armed.
It took about 2 years, or very close to 2 years, to get this legislation through Congress. It was an enormous amount of work for us, for GOA, and for a large group of airline pilots and many wonderful, good people in Congress who supported us and helped us. Today, 22 years after the signing of the Arming Pilots Against Terrorism Act of 2002, John Velleco and Eric Pratt of Gun Owners of America have invited all of us who participated in this effort to get together, talk about the work that we all did together, talk about the amazing success of the Arming Pilots program and how successful, how safe, and how cost-effective this program has been.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here, and we're going to talk about the fight to arm pilots, but why don't we start by introducing ourselves, so we'll start over here.
Okay, yeah, my name's Bob Lambert. I was the captain for a major airline on 9/11. I was one of the founding members of the Airline Pilot Security Alliance, which helped pick out the cockpit.
Philip Beal. I, too, was a captain for a major carrier on the 9/11 event, and was also in a leadership position with the Allied Pilots Association, where we took a lead role in establishing the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program.
And I'm Al Aitken. I was the chairman of the Washington domicile for American Airlines. And along with Phil Beal here, we organized the Committee for the Armed Defense of the Cockpit with the Allied Pilots Association, and we worked towards arming pilots.
I'm Tracy Price. I'm also on 9/11. I was an airline captain, and along with Bob and Scott and some other good men, I was among the founders of the Airline Pilots Security Alliance, and we worked with Allied Pilots Association to get pilots armed.
My name is Scott Lewis. I was also an airline captain on 9/11, and I worked with Bob here and Tracy as a co-founder of the Airline Pilots Security Alliance, and enjoyed working with the Allied Pilots people to arm pilots.
Leon Lalagian. I was a first officer on 9/11. I was involved with my security committee at my pilot group. I created a cockpit defense security committee. Started working right away. I'm from New Hampshire, so Bob Smith was my senator, and got to meet Brian Darling and rolled up sleeves and started working.
I'm Robert Sprock. I was a first officer on September 11th, 2001, and I was also vice chairman in Miami for the Allied Pilots Association with Phil and Al.
Brian Darling, former general counsel for Senator Bob Smith from New Hampshire. Senator Smith was the chief advocate in the Senate for arming pilots.
So just to set the stage in terms of timeline, obviously on 9/11, pilots were not armed, but up through the 80s, into the late 80s, pilots could be armed. So what changed?
On December 7th of 1987, there was a PSA flight. They had merged with U.S. Air, so it was Flight 1771 that was hijacked by a former PSA. He had been fired, a former PSA employee who worked in ground operations. And he boarded that airplane illegally with a 44 Magnum revolver, and he shot a flight attendant, executed both pilots, and the airplane ended up obviously crashing, killing everybody on board. And the response of the FAA to that killing was to mandate that all pilots, only pilots and flight attendants, not ground ops employees, go through security screening every time they went from the non-secure side to the secure side of the airport. And that effectively, there were lots of pilots that carried firearms in their flight bags But that ended that once that requirement, and that was effective January 1 of 1988.
Ironically enough, if I could follow on to that, in what continues to be a trend, I believe, with many of the bureaucratic agencies involved in aviation and security, the rule that you had to be screened was so long as you walked up to the screening device, you couldn't bypass it. But if there was a door over there that you could go through and you could go around it, you could do that. So it's mostly about optics rather than effectiveness.
I want to add complacency led to August of 2001. Then FAA Administrator Jane Garvey struck the provision from the books that really required us to have a law, because it now was no longer a regulation allowing pilots to be armed.
Okay, so that happened in August of 2001.
Yes, and I put that on complacency because you just think, well, we don't need that anymore.
Pilots were allowed to be armed by regulation, but no airline had gone through the process to arm any pilots. So the pilots who were armed in the 80s and putting guns in their flight bags of their own volition, in some cases were probably just operating on their own. And there were large numbers of them. I can remember flying with captains. I was first officer back then. And I can remember flying with captains who had a revolver or some kind of a firearm in their flight bag.
So with that absent, then what would have been the protocol for how to deal with a hijacking?
Comply.
So comply was what was the protocol in every single plane on 9/11?
Industry standard.
Industry standard. They chose to accommodate evil instead of resisting evil.
Well said. So what started then the effort to bring guns back onto the plane? What launched that effort?
It was a paradigm shift. I mean, before we were going to negotiate with the terrorists, but then when we saw on 9/11 what they would do, then we knew we had to confront evil. And it was just common sense to all of us sitting here on these benches to arm pilots so that prevent them from taking over the airplane and using it as a weapon of mass destruction.
So it was no longer about killing a few hundred people on a plane. It was about killing thousands of people on the ground.
And the regulation that we spoke about that was taken out of the books began to be taken out of the books about the time that we had intel that there was going to be a hijacking operation by terrorists. That effort continued after 9/11. So that regulation didn't get completely taken off the books until I think it was October of 2001.
So, well, let's talk about that then. So here the effort is underway. You guys are backing this. What were the hurdles to getting, because obviously legislation was going to be needed, so what were the hurdles to getting armed pilots legislation passed?
I think you need to understand that there were parallel efforts happening at the same time. Allied Pilots Association was involved. ALPA was sort of involved, but a little bit wondering what they were going to do. There was another organization just forming, the Airline Pilot Security Alliance, APSA, with Tracy Price and Bob Lambert and a fellow named Bob Guida, if I remember his name correctly. So we knew there were a lot of efforts happening sort of in the same direction and in parallel. And it was a little while before we actually merged our efforts together. And that's when we really started making ground.
Great. And then, in terms of, talk a little bit about some of the hurdles that you started facing.
I think the biggest hurdle was when the TSA was formed, you had top people in the TSA all the way up to executive branch that were really very obviously not on board with that type of program. They wanted to handle it in-house on trying to get people stopped on the ground, and their thinking was, why would he introduce weapons into the airplane when we're trying to keep them out of the airplane on the ground? So this is what they were thinking, in my opinion, about not letting pilots have firearms in the cockpit.
Let's take a step back. So Congress was motivated to do something. And initially, they wanted to create a giant bureaucracy to, increase screening and do a lot of things. And initially, arming pilots was not even mentioned. It was not even on the table. This is something that was pushed by pilots and forced into the conversation during the debate that ended up resulting in the creation of the Transportation Security Administration. Because you look back, it took two pieces of legislation to create the Department of Homeland Security and eventually create the law that is in place today that secured armed pilots. I mean, the first go-around in the fall of 2001, there was an effort to create the TSA, and in that piece of legislation, they had a provision in there that started the program, but empowered the head of the TSA to stop the program, which happened. So the whole process to get pilots armed, it was a 2-year process or a 1.5-year process, and it ended up with the legislation that created the Department of Homeland Security, and the administration at the time was against it from day one until they were forced to do so by Congress. Congress was very motivated, though. You had members on both sides of the aisle that supported the idea because they were in Washington on 9/11. They evacuated their offices, were scrambling to go to safe zones and to get into a safe area. Subsequent to that, there was another evacuation when there was another airplane that came into the airspace, and it motivated members, and even members who were Democrats who weren't predisposed to be pro-gun, to support this idea, which ended up having a great deal of support in Congress. But initially, this was not on the table at all. It was forced into the conversation by pilots who understood that this was the most effective way to protect the cockpit against terrorists.
And by the way, it was Brian Darling that really headed up the effort on the legislative side. He was the certainly among, if not the most important players that were congressional staff, Senator or House, that we relied on. And I was fortunate enough to meet Brian very early on, and he directed us and guided us in a way that made a huge difference. I don't know that it would have happened otherwise.
Brian was a young guy.
Yeah,
highly energetic.
It was really funny.
Highly energetic guy, but most importantly, extremely knowledgeable guy. Yeah. He worked well with so many people and gave us excellent guidance.
You know, so it felt forever things, result oriented, if you will. And I can recall getting very frustrated at all of us, I think, about how slow our perception of how slow this was moving forward. Brian's like, yeah, this is moving forward pretty quick. Trust me. So it kind of put our mind at ease a little bit with that.
Another hurdle was the convincing the American people, and especially the media, that this was a sane, common sense thing to do. We had some really inane questions asked of us as we went from one media outlet to another, like, aren't we afraid of shooting out the windows in the cockpit? Another one was they were afraid that if we shot a hole in the side of the airplane, everybody would be sucked out.
Because we'd seen it in James Bond.
Thank you, Hollywood.
That's right. So I heard you ask a question about opposition. The opposition that I noted was bureaucrats who wanted to grow the size of their empire. They didn't want 100,000 volunteer airline pilots to be armed. They wanted to hire 100,000 federal air marshals. And you also had airline management, quite candidly. They were opposed. They'd spent the last 30 years post-deregulation doing a lot to diminish the profession of being an airline pilot. And I think a lot of them were laying awake at night worried that tomorrow 100,000 airline pilots were going to come to work carrying a gun, and they were not interested in that. So we had to overcome those, and part of the way that we overcame those opponents was with public pressure. The education process, keeping the issue front and center for our passengers so that they would pressure Congress and the administration and everybody else involved. And don't forget, congressmen are passengers. Every senator, except for the handful that are near Washington, D.C., and the same thing for the representatives, they almost all commute to work by air. So we had opportunities to chat with them on board our airplanes, and I never had one that told me that they were opposed to it whenever I engaged them directly in one of those conversations.
Yeah, I remember Senator Barbara Boxer, who is of California, had never cast a pro-gun vote in her life, supported this legislation.
I can remember she was a fearful flyer. She was somebody that was afraid of being on an airplane when everything was going fine. And there are a lot of people that are like that, and she was among them.
But she also was a hero. I mean, she really stepped up. You know, you can criticize Boxer for many of her positions on gun issues, which I would.
Yeah.
But on this issue, she was critical to getting it passed because she showed that this had bipartisan support. It was not something, it was not a conservative versus liberal issue. It was a common sense issue.
So on September 5th, 2002, she carried the day on the Senate floor.
This must never happen again. Providing more armed federal marshals and enhanced cockpit doors will help. However, and this is why this bill is so important, this amendment is so important, not all flights will have the protection of air marshals, and new, more secure cockpit doors will not be installed overnight. As an absolute last line of defense, our government has authorized U.S. jet fighters to shoot down an airliner if hijackers gain control of it. To authorize such action without empowering pilots to defend the cockpit against hijackers is both illogical and unacceptable.
You were down there on the Senate floor. Al and I were in Brian's office, and Senator Fritz Hollings was trying to block it. In fact, I think it was Senator John McCain read a letter signed by every airline director and CEO opposing the measure. Senator Boxer kept keeping everyone on track. And then as Fritz Hollings was speaking, he'd be writing on a piece of paper at the podium, and you'd see him hand it off, and you'd see a hand come in to the we were watching on the monitor in Brian's office. It was his hand taking the paper, and the phone would ring. And Al would answer the phone, and Brian would say, he wants to do this. And we'd talk about it, and Al would say, yeah, you can't do that because, and we'd see the paper come back into the screen, and he'd take it, and he'd say something else, and he'd write something, and we went back and forth on that a few times. She went to the mat that day. She pushed back and got people who were resisting and opposed to get off their dime. And that vote passed that day, I would say, because of her. I put her in, hard-pressed to hear it based on what we just discussed about her record with firearms, but she was a hero that day.
As Phil said, this September 11th happened on a Tuesday, and that was not a commuting day. And I think a lot of these folks realize that if these terrorists had chosen Friday or a Monday to do what they did, that it probably could have taken out a few of their comrades up here as well. So, yeah, the idea of I get on a great big airplane full of gas to go home every weekend, I think was near and dear to their heart.
You talk about hurdles. One thing that we should mention, though, is what made it a little bit easier. And it was right after 9/11, so emotions were hot at that time throughout the country. We wanted something done, something that would be effective. And that made it a little bit easier. That helped us overcome some of the hurdles.
Yeah, you talk about obstructions. You had bureaucrats in the Bush administration that were opposed to this. You had members of Congress like John McCain and Fritz Hollings, Democrat from South Carolina, who opposed this idea. They were the ranking members and chairman of the committees of jurisdiction, so they had a lot of power over this issue. You had the airlines banding together, writing letters to Congress members saying this is a bad idea. But you had the American people and you had pilots coming to Congress saying that this is a great idea because it just makes sense. And, you know, one of the most important aspects of overcoming the hurdles was the pilots. They were coming to Washington. They were going door to door, knocking on doors, just showing up in offices saying, I want to talk to you about this issue. I mean, I've never seen anything like it before nor since, where you had all of these individuals coming in, just knocking on the door, walking into a Senate office or House office saying, I want to meet with your staffer. I want to meet with the member to talk to you about this issue. And a lot of members were convinced just by face-to-face meetings with pilots.
Yeah, I think early on, we knew of each other. We knew that the Airline Pilots Association had taken a position that was counter to what we were trying to get done. But we knew that early on, us at ABSA knew that the Allied Pilots Association, in particular, Al and Phil, were really doing amazing work. So we were able to reach out to them. And Al and I both live in Northern Virginia, so the two of us, spent a lot of time together. He'd show up at my house on his way into D.C., and we had coffee on the way, and we talked about who we were going to try to talk to. And
that was about 2 or 3 times a week for many months.
Yeah, and I think to say that the successful effort to arm pilots was because of any one organization, certainly any one individual, with possible exception of Brian, is just a misnomer. This was an effort between GOA, absolutely, the Allied Pilots Association. I think APSA played an important role, but it was a team effort. It was an effort of like-minded individuals that put in the work.
APSA had over 50,000 members, half of which were probably pilots. The rest were just normal people doing their jobs. And with one email, pressing the enter button, APSA was able to get 50,000 phone calls into one senator's office. And we received phone calls that says, how do we make this stop?
Right. They get calls, hey, stop. Calling it. Tell your story, Scott.
I happened to go to the chairman of the House Transportation Committee one day after APSA had put out an alert. And I got ushered right into the chairman. Usually I have to talk to the staffer. I got ushered, and Brian remembers this, because I called him. I was crying like a little girl after this. So,
Don Young.
Yeah, it was Don Young. And I thought, and they ushered me, go, wait a minute, we're going to get you right in to see him. And I thought, well, this is pretty cool because you don't usually get to see the guy, right? That wasn't very cool. So he read me the riot act up and down. They couldn't use their phones for 2 days. They couldn't call out. We're on your side. Why are you doing this to us? I said, all we did was put out an alert. And he goes, all right. Well, then after that, so then I left with my tail between my legs. So I called Brian. But then you tell the rest of the story about how that worked out.
Oh, yeah. It didn't. I mean, that was one thing that happened actually more than once where, the phone lines would get jammed up and members get all mad. Not because they don't, they say, we agree with you. Why are you doing this? Why are you targeting us? And guys like Don Young didn't take too kindly to that. I mean, he's well known for being very aggressive and somebody who was, threatened other members. But, he's somebody who you want on your side. You don't want to tick off members by locking up their phone lines when they're supposed to be an ally. And yes,
it was wild.
This was a long fight. I mean, this is something that, we thought we won in the fall of 2001 when they started, TSA was created. They had a program with 4 conditions on it. In April of 2002, the head of the TSA, John McGaugh at the time, decided to veto the program and stop the program. Well, all of a sudden we had to start all over again. So, it was something where we were lulled into a sense of security that it had happened. And then all of a sudden in April of 2002, we had to start all over again from scratch and get back on the battlefield and make members understand that the next chance they get to pass something, they need to pass a program that actually puts it in law.
We were told it was dead on arrival. Don't waste our time. And the transmission must have been garbled because
That's a beautiful example of not taking things at face value as Congress people present it to you and just saying, okay, well, then you're going to hear from those people that I'm going to send my alert out to. Grassroots activism really works, and it's tremendous hearing these stories.
I just want to tag on to that the Second Amendment organizations were, and GOA, you guys were fantastic. We couched this thing as a national security issue, and that was helpful in getting a lot of people on board, Democrats that are generally anti-gun. They said, well, I can sign on to that. I can sign on to national security. But it wasn't just APSA that was issuing alerts. You guys were issuing alerts that we would get huge numbers of gun owners from all over the country. And we were able to do it thanks to Bob's efforts. And you guys obviously could. You could tailor it to a zip code. And, so you could say, okay, this particular member, we need some help with this particular member. GOA, APSA, and the Second Amendment community rose up and supported us, and that was so huge. That was so
a great
coalition effort.
I remember Brian would tell us that if an office receives 5 calls on a subject, it raises an eyebrow. If they get 10 calls, they start having some conversation about it. If there's 20 or more, these are literal numbers, then they feel like they got to do something. So, and I tell people this today because people think, I'm not going to call. They don't care about my phone call. I'm like, no, it makes a difference. It makes a difference. So it's a good lesson.
The expertise of, Gun Owners of America was very helpful in drafting the legislation too. I mean, I know that Ron Paul had some great legislation in the House. John Hostetler was pushing his version in the House. And all of that ended up helping to get us across the finish line. We ended up, in a coalition with a number of different groups. I mean, even flight attendants came on board at one point to be helpful. And you end up having Barbara Boxer and Bob Smith, 2 very different politicians, one conservative, one liberal. And that was a result of the efforts of everybody.
I just wanted to add, there's an entity that we haven't talked much about, and that was the Public Affairs Company that really helped out in this. The Shirley and Bannister Public Affairs, Diana Bannister in particular, opened up a huge number of doors for us. Got Phil and I and Tracy and I and some of the others into a number of different organizations' meetings, including, for example, the Americans for Tax Reform. You would think, well, why would we go to them? It's because they have a huge audience. So we go, she opens the door up for us, and we talk at their meeting, the Americans for Tax Reform, and then all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of people are aware of what we're doing.
So before moving forward, I want to go back to one of the hurdles that you all had mentioned, and that was with the TSA. And, as the years would progress, studies would show that anywhere from 80 to 95% of the time there's a failure rate in detecting weapons. Now, those studies may not have been public yet as you guys are fighting for arming the pilots, but was that's nevertheless part of the dialogue? Was there a sense that maybe this, at least in the Congress, that just trying the one approach to trying to screen guns out wasn't going to be a fail-safe?
We routinely say they can't stop weapons from going into prisons, right? So, it's the same thing. How are they going to stop all weapons from getting on an airplane?
And even post 9/11, after everything was supposedly tightened up, weapons were still being found, abandoned out in airplanes, stuck under a seat somewhere, that had been brought on the airplane illicitly somehow.
It's just from the bread truck, box cutters left behind, or whatever else, something that would be used as a weapon.
It was only 3 months after September 11th that Richard Reed was able to smuggle a bomb on an airplane in his shoes.
That's right.
And the FBI had even alerted the airline managements 10 days prior to that somebody's going to be trying to bring bombs on board in your shoes. We all showed up at work, had no idea what was going on, why all of a sudden we had to take our shoes off just to get through the magnetometer. And we'll touch on Richard Reed a little bit later, but these things are going down in the background, and it was obvious that things needed to be done.
To this day, you hear all kinds of media reports that TSA loves to advertise how many, weapons, edged weapons, firearms that they discover. Often, if you read that news reporting, often it's on the return trip. So that means that they missed it on the way out. Some of the opposition, Eric, was attitudinal, like these guys are talking about, that they didn't want to diminish their position because they're law enforcement and we're pilots. But some of it was very bureaucratic in nature, in the sense that the TSA, and the biggest part of their budget, I think it was the last numbers I saw, and this some time ago, was $900 million for the Federal Air Marshal Program. And that's a big hunk of money. If we can get huge numbers if we have a vigorous, successful armed pilot program, and the pilots are in a position that is tactically superior to defend the cockpit than the Federal Air Marshals in the back, that's a threat to that Federal Air Marshal Program. And when Al and I briefed the first head of the Federal Air Marshals, a guy named Tom Quinn, it was clear that was his concern. He was concerned about the maintenance of his own bureaucracy and what a threat the improved security by arming airline pilots might pose to that bureaucracy.
Yeah, they want control. I mean, they really want control. And it showed early on in the debate when you had members saying, why don't we deputize these pilots? And, they can bring their own guns and just get them certified. I mean, it wouldn't have cost anything. This is a program that would have cost zero if it was done the way that it was originally envisioned. But of course, you have government that wants to bureaucracy build, create this massive army of federal air marshals and seniors that we see today that I don't think makes us any safer. I mean, basically, when you look at 9/11, the targets were pilots and flight attendants to get to the pilots. And there was no effort to them, individuals who were targeted. And that's a problem. I mean, you had all these ideas that nothing to do with protecting the individuals who controlled the aircraft. There's obviously screening that goes on when you go to get on an aircraft, but ultimately the last line of defense was in the cockpit, and they did not want that last line of defense to be armed.
I want to be clear, too. I want to kind of flip the narrative on this. There was the bureaucratic opposition in the administrative bureaucratic opposition to what we were doing. But one of the things that I attempted to accomplish, and I know others did as well, was to reassure the people who were doing the Federal Air Marshal frontline personnel and people in management, we were not trying to usurp what they did. We were trying to augment what they did because, as I told individual senators, the truth of the matter is we have millions of flights a year in the airline industry. There's no way we're going to be able to put federal air marshals on even a significant fraction of those flights domestically. And so you're going to have the problem of boredom. It's an incredibly boring job for a federal air marshal to sit back there when there's nothing wrong going on. And then you've always got to have pilots in the cockpit. And then you've got the taxpayers who can't afford to hire all these hundreds of thousands of federal air marshals. You got to strike a balance. What the taxpayers can afford to do, and what we did was we provided a very common sense and economical path to augment federal air marshals who, people who are federal flight deck officers today, they're partnered with FAMs. They're supervised by FAMs. They train with FAMs. They qualify at FAM facilities. And so I want to make sure that we make a clear distinction that the bureaucratic inertia to oppose the federal flight deck officer program stand-up was a lot of times born of ignorance. And I think today what's been discovered is we're very effective, we're very cost-effective, and I suspect that if you talk to people in the FAM program and at the highest levels of management, they would say it's been a success.
So to that, we've talked about a lot of the hurdles and the opposition. Where have you seen people now basically converting and saying, you know what, this is a good program, and so the thinking changing and people now supporting it in either the other airline associations or in TSA or FAA? I mean, describe where you've seen some of the change in thinking.
We heard all kinds of really irresponsible suppositions about all these things that might happen if we were armed. We might get mad and shoot each other. But time has proven that those concerns were really ill-founded. We've had, the numbers are closely held, but huge numbers of airline pilots carrying guns for 20 plus years now. And the number of problems is minuscule. They are minuscule. We've got an extremely successful, amazingly safe, and as Phil said, an incredibly cost-effective deterrent. So that just the passage of time and the success of the program, and it turns out pilots are pretty responsible people that you can kind of count on to, show up when they say they'll show up and be level-headed and do their job and respond to emergency situations properly. That's what we're all trained to do. It turns out that I think that in itself has changed a lot of minds. I think the people look at it now and say, well, maybe some of that was a little bit overwrought.
And that's a great point. I mean, in talking about the success, Tracy, you mentioned that there's been minuscule problems, but counterbalance that with how many planes have been hijacked since 9/11 and flown into buildings.
That'd be zero. Yeah, that number would be zero.
This was a paradigm shift, as Bryce pointed out and as Leon pointed out. This is a paradigm shift to help the crew, to arm pilots. And by the way, not only has there not been any problems, there are a tiny number of problems since arming pilots after 9/11, but pilots carried for decades, as we've talked about earlier, without any problems. Pilots were not doing the silly things with firearms even before them. The paradigm prior to 9/11 was called the common strategy, which we talked about is everybody just give up and do whatever this hijacker tells you to do. Under that paradigm, 19, whatever you want to call these individuals, 19 individuals killed 2,977 people. 19 crazy people, barely armed, managed to kill 2,977, mostly Americans. When you got 19 crazy people, barely armed, can kill almost 3,000 of us, that's a rotten paradigm. We need to change it.
So it's been incredibly successful. We haven't had any incidents. Have there been actually, the preventative effect you can never quantify in one sense, because you don't know how many people might have thought about doing something but then didn't because now they know pilots are armed. But I'm curious if maybe there's any bad guys that didn't get the memo, still tried to hijack a plane, and there was an armed pilot to greet them. So were there those actual examples, or has it just been like dead silence? Now bad guys try other avenues to strike terror.
I think there are two different things to talk about there. There's, we've always had the issue with an unbalanced, possibly an individual who's taken drugs or maybe has had too much to drink. That individual has really never been a significant threat. Even before 9/11, passengers rose up to control that individual. And that still happens. You'll still hear about that occasionally. And that I don't want to make light of that. That's a serious problem when that happens. But it's nothing compared to a team of murderers who have spent the last year and a half training together to control a cabin full of strangers who've never met each other and take control of the airplane, murder the pilots, and fly it into a building. And that has not happened.
So it's been incredibly successful. We've heard stories about converts. Are there still areas of resistance? Are there still attempts to try to overturn this or water it down?
Remember that panel that we had with the Heritage Foundation?
Yeah.
And the reason we had that was because in the Obama administration, they were trying to cut the funding, I think, by half, if I remember correctly.
You're right. That's...
And we were back in town to try to talk about the program again and how successful it was and how cost-effective it was. Mike Carnes quoted numbers like about $15 per flight with an FFDO on board as opposed to $3,000 a flight with FAM.
Yeah, the success of the program, the fact that it has been such an amazing deterrent is its own enemy. Because we haven't had this happen in 20 some odd years. We don't need to do this anymore.
There's a few things that can be improved. again, kudos to the FBI when they came up with their cockpit protection program. The TSA was completely flat-footed. We had put in the legislation that it was to be enacted 90 days after the bill's passage, and the TSA had done nothing in preparation. In fact, they lobbied against the thing passing. So when the time came, they went to Congress and said, hey, we need more time to get ready for this. And Congress, to their credit, said, no, this is when you do it. So they ordered the FBI to hand over their program. That program, very good. The downside was TSA, in collaboration with airlines, bastardized it, and they had initially determined to make it so onerous pilots would not want to volunteer. So
we literally heard that.
Those were their own words.
Those were from a TSA attorney. Al and I were at the implementation meetings of exactly how we're going to go about doing this. And we had a TSA attorney tell us, okay, congratulations, you got your law passed. But you know what? We're going to make this thing so cumbersome and so difficult for the end user, that would be the pilot, that nobody's going to volunteer. Now, having said that, the TSA has grown up a bureaucracy within the TSA that the maintenance of their bureaucracy does now depend upon a successful armed pilot program. So they've become a lot less adversarial towards the actual armed pilot that's out there flying along. It was something that Brian Darling predicted would probably occur.
It's also another point. So one of the obstructions, too, was when it looked like we were going to win, at the last minute, there was an attempt to change the language of the law to use the word weapon instead of firearm, which would have allowed some flexibility with the administration to maybe use tasers, because there was a lot of talk about not giving pilots firearms. They wanted maybe tasers or something short of a firearm. And that was a last-minute fight that we won, and we ended up winning, but it was close. I mean, that could have really dramatically changed the program, but it's something, thankfully, that we fixed. And
we had such a good success rate with the vote, too. I believe in the Senate there was 87 in favor.
90-9 in the Senate, 1 abstain.
And what that did was that made it veto-proof, and so the White House kind of had to get on board. They were
same thing in the House. It was also veto-proof in the House.
But yeah, it was we kind of got our point across.
Yeah. So the Bush administration opposed us with tooth and nail. Everything they had, they threw everything they could at us to try to make sure this thing didn't happen. Once the veto-proof majority comes through, Al and I are sitting in the East Room because we got invited because Bush thought it was a great idea.
So I got to add a story that kind of becomes an addendum to this whole thing. At the last minute, during the election break in 2002, the cargo lobby managed to get cargo pilots cut out of the legislation. I went to the Hill. Brian gave me a call, let me know what happened. I remember I went to Transportation and Infrastructure in the House, and I can't remember the staff member's name. He looked at me and said, "What are you doing here? You got what you wanted. What do you want now?" And I said, "Cargo pilots got cut out. Someone changed the language during the election break." And he thought I was nuts, and he checked. He was a little shocked. So we went about making plans in December of 2002 to start off 2003 with a congressional briefing and make things happen. We partnered up with Senator Conrad Burns, and I was working with his legislative director. And come January, I called. I finally got the chief of staff. He said, "Oh, he doesn't work here anymore. I'm going to need about 3 months to get up to speed on this." And I didn't think I had the time frame to do that. I got with Brian. There was another staff member, senior guy, David Schweeder. They helped me figure out how. I didn't have a sponsor now. I had to make my invitations as such that I could get people to come without the sponsor. They got me a room. I stayed up all night faxing invitations out, and 8 a.m. I started calling everyone. I sent an invitation. We had the briefing. I had a packed room. I spoke. Mark Flagg, who's not here. Mark is, these guys know, tragically lost his parents on 9/11 on Flight 77, the attack on the Pentagon. And then we had the fortune and honor to know there's an Israeli guy, Rafi Ron, who introduced behavior pattern recognition at Boston Logan Airport and through the country and other security measures. He spoke. So we had the attention of everybody. I had a line at the podium at the end of the briefing. The first guy standing in line was a guy named William Henderson, still works on the Hill, but he worked for Senator Jim Bunning at the time. And he just said, when you're done here, come see me in my office. And after we finished all the conversations, went up there, and he was sitting with his chief of staff, Dave Young, I think his name was, and they said, our boss wants to do this. And we had a great relationship that year. Senator Bunning was awesome. I wish he was still alive, because as a Hall of Fame baseball player, my son plays baseball now, I'd love those guys to meet. But he went to the mat for us. We tried to make some fixes to the problems we had with the first bill. But by the end of 2003, we had a second piece of legislation and put the thing back together, made it work.
I got one more too I want to throw in here, and that was Al and I went and met with the Chief of Staff and Legislative Aide for Trent Lott. Trent Lott was the minority leader for the Republicans in the Senate. We'd started getting word that the legislation was getting legs, was the term they used, meaning it was probably going to wind up getting a vote the next couple of weeks. And so Al and I go in and meet with these two guys. We were set up to go do that. These guys were like, hey, we hear that your legislation is going to get legs in the next week or two. We wanted to chat with you guys about maybe a little tweak to the language. We'd like to be able to give airline management the prerogative on whether their pilots could participate or not. Al goes, well, just last week we were talking to Ivy League law school professor that we've contracted with to review our language and make sure everything was done well. He's an expert on everything to do in this whole topic. He said if we gave airline management that level of latitude back, all of the effort that we'd gone to with this legislation to indemnify the pilot participant and their air carrier employer would go right out the window, because they would be reintroducing their own liability if at the pilot level or at their whole airline they decided that they didn't want to participate. And I'll never forget the look on the Chief of Staff's face when he looked at that legislative aide alert and goes, oh my gosh, is that right? And the guy goes, wow, it sure is. And he goes, okay, I guess we're not going to be able to put that language in there. Al and I go out in the hall and just beat them at their own game.
There were some sweet moments.
Well, as one of millions of people who flies, I'm very grateful to you all for the effort that you put in, the personal time you took off. I mean, in doing this without pay and lobbying, and we're very grateful to you, and very grateful for you coming in to town today to tell your stories. And so, thank you very much. You've told it beautifully. I think this will be make for a real interesting story to tell. So thank you.
Today, 23 years after 9/11, airline pilots have been rearmed for 22 years. Airline flying has never been safer. All of the predicted terrible consequences that would occur if airline pilots were carrying guns have not occurred. It's proven to be exceptionally safe, and airline flying has never been safer than it is now. There have been no repeated attempts at 9/11 style attacks on airliners since airline pilots have been rearmed. And we have Gun Owners of America, John Velleco, Eric Pratt, and all of the Second Amendment community that supports Gun Owners of America to thank.
If you like this content, please like, share, comment, and subscribe.
And make sure you support Gun Owners of America by visiting gunowners.org. They're continuously fighting for the Second Amendment. And also check out our future content and past content by visiting gunsoutTV.com.
Make sure you subscribe to the newsletter, because that's where all the important information goes out. Let's go.
And get some.